Hello, my name is Daniel Kaufman. I head the Natural Resource Governance Institute, also called NRGI, and I'm also a member of the International Board of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about how to view governance in general, and then particular elements relevant for governance in natural resources will be addressed. Specifically, first, what is governance and how do we measure it in general? And also, what does it mean for the citizens of resource-rich countries and for the extractive sectors in particular? Second, on the importance of having good national level governance as a key enabler for effectively managing natural resources. So it's the enabling environment. Third, accountability. On accountability, what is the role of different stakeholders in ensuring that accountability, holding governments to account, does take place? And fourth, on the power of data, in order to make reform advocacy more evidence-based. So then, what do we mean when we talk about governance? Getting to the first aspect of this session. And how do we measure it? We define governance as a set of traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. But that's general. What does that mean in practice? More concretely, okay, there are three key dimensions within that governance notion of the institutions that exercise authority. One is the political dimension of governance. The second is the economic dimension, and the third is the institutional or institutional respect dimension. First, on the political dimension, which is the process by which those who are in authority are selected, are monitored, and are replaced. We unbundle the political dimension into two measurable indicators. One is the extent to which a country exhibits voice and democratic accountability, and the other is the extent to which there is political stability and absence of violence and terrorism. The second dimension of governance is the economic dimension, which refers to the capacity of government to formulate and implement policies and deliver public services. And that again unbundles into two measurable indicators. One is government effectiveness, and the other is the regulatory quality. And the third dimension is institutional respect, the respect of citizens and state for the institutions that govern the interactions among them. And that again is mapped to two indicators, the quality of the rule of law and the control of corruption. One of the advantages of this framework is that it highlights the important distinction between control of corruption on the one hand, and broader notions of governance on the other. This is important because of the simple notion that one doesn't fight corruption by fighting corruption. One needs to address the governance weaknesses across the whole institutional system. In many countries, it is voice and accountability the weakness, or the lack of a free press, or no transparency, or the absence of rule of law, or weak regulations, it may be the case. Since the mid-90s, when we constructed these worldwide governance indicators, we have been collecting and aggregating data from around the globe every year from about 30 different sources for over 200 countries. Various visualization tools allow comparisons over time, so we can, for instance, note the stark comparison of how Colombia has improved over time in most indicators over the period as opposed to its neighbor Venezuela, which has deteriorated. And you may be thinking that maybe this is kind of interesting, but some of you may be saying, well, so what? Does governance really matter? These are interesting measures, but does it matter? The answer is an unambiguous yes. We have found that, on average, a country that improves its quality of governance in terms of controlling corruption, rule of law, and the other dimensions, over time improves its per capita income threefold. So a country that today has $5,000 per capita income, in the long term, it takes a while for the fruits to be reaped of this good governance. It will get to $15,000 per capita. That's what we call the 300% development dividend of good governance. We find similar dividends of improving governance in terms of reducing infant mortality, in terms of improved education, and other research have also found a very positive impact on reducing inequality and in terms of getting higher domestic and foreign investment into the country. This is not just academic wonky talk. In my practitioner hat, I've witnessed this kind of improvements. In my own country, Chile, over a generation, we have had these kind of increases in well-being. And that's very much attributed to the enormous improvement in governance. This gets us into a crucial question for us. Does this also apply to natural resources? If you are, quote unquote, fortunate enough to have a lot of oil or a lot of mining, can that substitute for good governance? The answer to that question is, unfortunately, a resounding no. Natural resource wealth is key nowadays and is a major sector in about 60 countries around the world. These countries rely extensively on their wealth in oil, gas, and or mining. Yet in the majority of these countries, these resources are not managed very well or managed well at all. The data also tells us that over time, governance in resource-rich countries has not improved on average. To the contrary for this group, in fact, while in countries that are not resource-rich, there's been some improvement in governance indicators, as seen, for instance, on control of corruption. That's not the case for resource-rich countries. These are averages, of course, and they hide some good news when one gets into the details. There are, in fact, some notable exceptions of resource-rich countries that have done well, including some in Latin America, including my own Chile, also in Asia, also a few in Africa, showing that good governance and natural resources can coexist, that it can be done, and even that is not the norm at this point. That should offer hope to citizens of mismanaged sectors or countries that can look at other cases where things are working out. This is fundamental because, as we see in the data, we find that good governance matters for resource-rich countries at least as much, and possibly even more, than the 300% development dividend of good governance that applies globally that we just discussed. Now, we have talked mostly as if implying that governance is just a challenge for governments, when in fact it takes at least two, if not more, to tango. And that's why I think it's important, before I conclude, to talk about the enterprise sector, which is absolutely crucial player in this realm of good governance. We're talking about good governance, not just good government, including both in the enterprise sector, the private sector, and both domestic and multinationals. In fact, multinational, we know that at times they can either help or undermine good governance in general, but also including in the enterprise sector, the paramount importance of state-owned enterprises in oil and mining in particular. We also need to understand the extent to which civil society is engaged. Civil society is an absolutely crucial additional stakeholder in this. And it has to be able to operate, and that is absolutely paramount, to have civic space to ensure accountability, for which civil society is critical. Let's get now briefly into concrete approaches towards helping with solutions, so to improve more specifically governance in the natural resource sector. And I turn in particular to an analytical framework and diagnostic tool that we have developed with partners, namely the Natural Resource Charter. And the charter focuses on the whole chain of decision-making, starting from the discovery of, whether it's oil, gas, or mining, and the decision to extract, very much in the upstream of this chain, then focusing on what are the best practices in the country in getting a good deal, then managing the revenue from these resources that come from this deal, and even more downstream, then focusing on the best policies in order to exercise the crucial task of investing from these resources, these revenues, into vibrant development for the country. This charter framework has also been translated into a country benchmarking diagnostic tool so that any country can assess itself, both qualitatively, quantitatively, and in depth. Similarly, We have been developing tools to assess corruption risks and to help prevent corruption along that same decision-making chain. In summing up now, let me conclude with a few points, placing what we just discussed in brief perspective. First, we have to be rigorous and specific when we talk about governance and when we talk about corruption at the international, national, and extractive sector levels. Are we referring about rule of law or corruption or voice and accountability? This matters, and those are very different components of governance. We need to be clear also regarding what matters for extractive at the international, national, and sectoral level. We have to look beyond the sector also for the solutions. The overall enabling environment, national and international, matters enormously. So it's much more than just a sectoral challenge. In fact, for many countries, beyond the sectoral challenge, it is the overarching development challenge, like for Nigeria, for Venezuela, and for many, many others. Second, we said that one cannot fight corruption by fighting corruption. It's not a matter of having another anti-corruption campaign or commission or another decree on anti-corruption. One has to do the hard work of assessing the governance weaknesses, including whether capture has taken place by the political and economic elite, and the weaknesses in rule of law, voice, media freedoms, regulations, and so on. Third, natural resource governance is not only a technocratic challenge, nor it is only about the public sector. Politics matter, so do the roles of the private sector, of the state-owned enterprises, and the role of civil society is absolutely crucial in making governments accountable. That's why transparency is so important, which is at the core of a separate session, and therefore didn't get all the coverage here. And then, finally, there is the power of data. The importance of evidence-based analysis and evidence-based policy advocacy. In fact, advocacy nowadays can be much more rigorous and powerful thanks to this power of data and diagnostic tools that have been developed. Through the application of tools and initiatives like the Natural Resource Charter, the Worldwide Governance Indicator, the Resource Governance Index, or RGI, which is also a separate session, and the EITI, which we address also in a separate session, one can help achieve progress in making the extractive sectors truly benefit citizens of resource-rich countries. Thank you very much.